Welcome. Before we begin, take a moment to look around you. Notice the glow of your screen, the soft light in the room, the quiet reassurance that at the press of a button, darkness can be pushed away. Now imagine all of that gone. No switches. No standby lights. No gentle glow from a device left charging overnight. Just darkness, thick, physical, and unavoidable. Tonight's story takes us into a world where darkness was not an occasional inconvenience, but a daily condition of life. A world where nightfall changed everything. This is Victorian family life before electricity, where every evening was a blackout, every room a maze of shadows, and light itself was something you counted, guarded, and feared losing. In the Victorian era, darkness was not empty. It had weight. It pressed into rooms, clung to walls, and filled every corner the moment the sun slipped below the horizon. When daylight faded, homes did not glow softly into the evening. They surrendered. Windows became black mirrors. Hallways vanished. Familiar furniture transformed into unseen obstacles waiting patiently for ankles and shins. Light came from flame, and flame was unreliable. A single candle was often all that stood between a household and complete blindness. It flickered, smoked, and bent with the slightest draft. It could die at any moment, plunging the room into instant night. And when it did, there was no backup. No second lamp humming to life. No emergency glow. Only the sudden awareness of how large and silent a room becomes when you cannot see your own hands. Victorian homes were built for daylight, not night. Rooms were crowded with heavy furniture, ornamental objects, and low door frames. During the day, these were signs of comfort and respectability. At night, they became hazards. Tables lurked where you did not remember them. Chairs seemed to move when no one was watching. Even walls felt closer in the dark, as if the house itself were shifting once the light disappeared. Darkness shaped behavior. Families moved less at night, spoke more quietly, and gathered into smaller spaces to conserve light. Entire households would share a single candle, huddling together not for warmth, but visibility. If you wanted to read, someone else had to sit close enough to share the glow. If you stood up, everyone noticed. Movement was a risk. Light was also expensive. Candles were made from tallow or wax, and both required money, labor, or livestock. Burning one unnecessarily was wasteful. Letting it drip too fast was careless. Dropping it was a small disaster. Children learned early that light was not a given. It was a resource, like food or fuel, and it could run out. This meant that night shortened life. Not in years, but in hours. Once darkness fell, productivity ended. Work slowed. Conversations faded. Even entertainment was shaped by the limits of flame. Reading strained the eyes. Sewing required intense focus. Games were simple, quiet, and often abandoned the moment the light grew too weak. The modern idea of staying up late did not exist in the same way. You did not choose bedtime. Darkness chose it for you. And darkness arrived early. In winter, the sun set while the day was still unfinished. Children returned from school only to find that homework would have to be done by candlelight. Adults came home from work to rooms already swallowed by shadow. Cooking, cleaning, and preparing for the next day all happened under flickering flame, with smoke stinging the eyes and soot settling on everything it touched. Every night was a calculated risk. Candles could tip. Sparks could fall. Houses were filled with wood, fabric, and dust. Fire was a constant danger, and every family knew someone who had lost everything to it. This awareness never left. Even in quiet moments, the flame was watched. A candle was never just a light. It was a responsibility. Outside, the darkness was even more complete. Streets were dimly lit, if at all. A few gas lamps might glow at intervals, but many neighborhoods relied on moonlight and memory. Walking after dark meant moving slowly, listening carefully, and trusting that the road was still where it had been that morning. Sounds carried farther at night. Footsteps echoed. Voices felt closer. The dark made every noise feel personal. Indoors, shadows performed their own quiet theater. Walls danced with distorted shapes. Faces looked unfamiliar. Children imagined movement where there was none. Adults pretended not to notice. Darkness encouraged imagination, and imagination was rarely kind. Every creak of the house felt louder. Every gust of wind sounded intentional. Even the most ordinary homes could feel uneasy once the light dropped low enough. This was the environment Victorian families accepted as normal. They did not talk about ambience or mood lighting. Darkness was not romantic. It was functional. It was something to endure, manage, and work around. People memorized their homes by touch. They learned where the floor dipped, where the table legs stood, where the stairs began. The body became a map, storing bruises and small injuries as reminders of where not to step. Children grew up knowing darkness intimately. They learned how to move silently, how to judge distance without sight, how to sit still for long periods. Fear was present, but so was familiarity. Night was not an event. It was a condition. And yet, there was something unifying about it. When the light was scarce, families gathered. There was no retreat into separate rooms glowing with individual screens. Everyone shared the same limited brightness. Conversations happened because there was nothing else to do. Silence was shared. Time slowed. The day's noise gave way to something quieter and more deliberate. Darkness forced togetherness. It erased distractions and stripped life down to its essentials: warmth, light, and company. You did not scroll. You waited. You listened. You noticed small things: the way the flame leaned when a door opened, the sound of breathing in the room, the rhythm of the house settling for the night. This was Victorian darkness. Not a momentary blackout, but a daily reality that shaped how people slept, worked, moved, and thought. It influenced family life in ways that are hard to imagine today, when light follows us everywhere. Before electricity, night was not conquered. It was negotiated with. And as we step deeper into this world, we begin to understand something important. The Victorians did not simply live in darker homes. They lived in a different relationship with time, space, and each other, one defined by the limits of flame and the certainty that when the sun went down, the world would shrink. This is where our story begins. Morning in the Victorian world did not arrive gently. It did not wait for readiness, comfort, or motivation. It came when it came, dragged in by the sun, the weather, and whatever noise happened to reach your ears first. There were no alarms to set, no snooze buttons to negotiate with, no universal agreement on when the day should begin. Morning was dictated entirely by forces beyond human control, and resisting it was not an option. The first signal was light. Not the soft, filtered glow we associate with modern mornings, but a blunt intrusion. Sunlight forced its way through thin, often grimy window panes and threadbare curtains, landing wherever it could. It illuminated dust, damp walls, and sleeping bodies without mercy. Victorian windows were not designed to protect rest. They were designed to let in as much daylight as possible because daylight was precious. When it arrived, it announced itself loudly. Sound followed close behind. Birds, unbothered by human fatigue, filled the early hours with frantic energy. Their calls echoed through narrow streets and thin walls, amplified by stone and wood. In rural areas, roosters performed their duties with enthusiasm and poor timing. In towns, carts rattled over cobblestones, vendors called out their wares, and factory whistles tore through the air like mechanical birds announcing the start of labor. These sounds did not fade into the background. They defined the morning. Sleep, already fragile, ended abruptly. Beds were rarely private spaces. Entire families shared rooms, sometimes sharing mattresses. Children slept wedged between siblings, cousins, or relatives who happened to be passing through. The idea of waking quietly was almost impossible. One person stirring set off a chain reaction, a groan here, a stretch there. Someone coughing, someone else muttering a complaint that carried no real anger, only exhaustion. Comfort was minimal. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or horsehair, uneven and prone to poking through the fabric. Pillows absorbed years of moisture and scent. Blankets were heavy but ineffective, holding cold as well as warmth. By morning, bodies were stiff, backs ached, and limbs felt older than they should have. Rest was functional, not restorative. The Victorian morning did not allow for hesitation. Once awake, you were expected to rise. Lying in bed after daylight was seen as wasteful, even suspicious. Time was already slipping away, and there was too much to do. The day's work depended on daylight hours, especially in winter, when the sun offered only a narrow window of usefulness. Getting out of bed was an exercise in coordination and patience. Floors were cold. Slippers, if you had them, were rarely where you left them. Stepping down meant feeling for solid ground, hoping you avoided toes, tails, or objects left behind in the dark. Floorboards creaked loudly, broadcasting your movement to everyone else in the house. Privacy ended the moment your foot touched the floor. The house itself seemed to wake grudgingly. Pipes rattled. Walls shifted slightly with temperature changes. The previous night's fire had long since died, leaving rooms colder than the air outside. Breath was often visible indoors, especially in winter. Washing your face meant plunging hands into water drawn from a pump, water that carried the chill of the earth itself. It woke you instantly, whether you wanted it to or not. Children were expected to be useful immediately. There was no concept of easing into the day. Beds were straightened as best they could be. Blankets were folded. Clothes were shaken out, checked for dampness, and pulled on quickly. Hair was combed, sometimes painfully, with wooden brushes that caught and pulled. Appearance mattered, but efficiency mattered more. Adults were already moving. Mothers, in particular, were often awake before anyone else. Fires needed to be lit. Water had to be fetched. Breakfast did not happen on its own. The sound of pots and kettles was both practical and symbolic. The day had begun, whether anyone felt ready or not. Morning fatigue was universal. Everyone was tired, and everyone knew it. This did not excuse anyone from their responsibilities. Complaints were met with stories of harder mornings, earlier rising, colder houses, heavier work. Each generation carried a mental archive of suffering, ready to be deployed as motivation or correction. Time moved differently in the morning. Without clocks in every room, the day unfolded according to light and routine. You knew roughly how much time you had by where the sun sat in the sky or how busy the street outside had become. Meals, chores, and departures were guided by habit rather than minutes. For working families, mornings were about preparation. Adults readied themselves for factories, workshops, fields, or markets. Children prepared for school or domestic labor. Tools were checked. Food was packed. Mistakes made in the morning echoed through the entire day. Forgetting an item meant doing without it until evening. Noise filled the house. Siblings argued over wash basins. Someone always took too long. Someone else spilled water. Voices overlapped, not in anger but in necessity. Space was limited and coordination was imperfect. The house functioned like a machine that had learned to work despite missing parts. Outside, the world was already active. Victorian mornings were public. Streets came alive early, and privacy dissolved the moment you stepped out the door. Neighbors saw each other daily, often in half-prepared states. This was normal. Everyone was in the same condition, pulled into wakefulness by the same forces. There was no illusion of choice. Morning was not a personal experience. It was communal, unavoidable, and relentless. You woke when the world told you to wake. You moved because staying still served no purpose. Fatigue was expected, not questioned. And yet, within this harshness, there was rhythm. The predictability of morning brought structure. The repetition of tasks anchored the day. Even exhaustion followed a familiar pattern. People knew what was expected of them before breakfast, after breakfast, before leaving the house. There was comfort in knowing your role, even if it was demanding. Morning defined the rest of the day. A late start meant lost daylight, unfinished work, and longer evenings spent catching up by weak candlelight. Rising with the sun was not discipline. It was survival. The Victorian morning was a negotiation between the human body and the natural world, and nature always held the upper hand. This was how the day began, not with intention, but with inevitability. Cleanliness in the Victorian era was not a simple matter of routine or preference. It was a challenge shaped by limited access to water, poor infrastructure, rigid social expectations, and incomplete scientific understanding. Staying clean required effort, planning, and often compromise. For many people, it was something aimed for rather than consistently achieved. Water did not flow freely into homes. There were no taps to turn, no hot showers waiting behind a curtain. Water had to be collected, usually from a communal pump, a well, or a nearby source shared by dozens of families. Each bucket was heavy, awkward, and precious. Every use of water was measured against how difficult it was to obtain the next bucket. This reality defined how people thought about washing. Full-body bathing was rare, especially for the working class. It required large quantities of water, time to heat it, and a suitable space, luxuries most homes did not have. Instead, cleanliness focused on visible areas. Faces, hands, and sometimes necks were washed daily, often with cold water. These were the parts of the body exposed to public view and therefore subject to judgment. Washing was often done from a basin placed on a table or stool. Water was poured sparingly. Soap, when available, was harsh and abrasive, made from animal fats and lye. It cleaned, but it also irritated skin, especially with frequent use. Many people associated soap with discomfort rather than freshness, which discouraged excessive washing. Hot water was especially valuable. Heating it required fuel, coal, or wood, which cost money and time. Fires had to be built and maintained. In colder months, the idea of using precious heat for bathing instead of warmth or cooking felt wasteful. As a result, warm water was reserved for the sick, the very young, or special occasions. Weekly bathing, often on a Saturday evening, became common in some households. This timing was practical. It allowed families to present themselves cleanly for Sunday church while minimizing the number of times water had to be heated. Even then, the process was communal. The same bathwater was reused, starting with the youngest or cleanest family members and ending with adults who had spent the day working. Privacy was limited. Bathrooms, as we know them, did not exist in most homes. Bathing took place in kitchens or bedrooms, behind screens or closed doors if space allowed. Embarrassment was normal, especially for older children and adults. Cleanliness came at the cost of comfort and dignity. Clothing played a crucial role in the appearance of cleanliness. Because washing the body was difficult, people relied on layers of clothing to absorb sweat and dirt. Undergarments were changed more frequently than outerwear. A clean shirt collar or cuffs suggested respectability, even if the rest of the outfit had not been washed in weeks. Laundry was an exhausting task. Washing clothes involved soaking, scrubbing, boiling, rinsing, wringing, and drying, often outdoors, regardless of weather. Soap was used sparingly, and fabrics wore down quickly under the process. For this reason, clothes were washed only when absolutely necessary. Stains were tolerated. Odors were masked with perfumes, herbs, or simply ignored. For the poor, cleanliness was even harder to maintain. Overcrowded housing meant shared spaces, shared water sources, and shared dirt. Entire families lived in single rooms with little ventilation. Waste accumulated quickly. Streets were often filthy, filled with animal droppings, refuse, and standing water. No amount of personal effort could fully counteract the environment. Despite this, Victorian society placed enormous moral weight on cleanliness. Being clean was associated with discipline, virtue, and respectability. Being dirty was often interpreted as a moral failing rather than a consequence of circumstance. This belief shaped how people judged one another and themselves. Children were taught early that cleanliness reflected character. Mothers bore the responsibility of maintaining their family's appearance, regardless of how unrealistic the expectation was. A clean child suggested a capable household. A dirty one invited judgment, pity, or suspicion. Medical understanding of hygiene was incomplete. Germ theory was not widely accepted until the late 19th century. Many people believed disease came from bad air, foul smells, or imbalanced bodily fluids. As a result, cleanliness focused more on smell than on unseen contamination. Strong odors were feared, while invisible threats went unnoticed. Perfumes, powders, and scented sachets were popular solutions. They did not remove dirt, but they made its presence less obvious. Homes were aired out when possible. Windows were opened briefly, even in winter, to release stale air. This was believed to restore health and balance. Public bathing facilities existed in some cities, promoted as tools of moral and physical improvement. However, access was limited, and many working-class families could not afford the fees or the time. For women, especially, public bathing raised concerns about propriety and safety. Cleanliness, then, was not a state but an effort, a constant negotiation between ideals and reality. People did what they could with what they had. They developed routines, shortcuts, and justifications. They learned to live with discomfort and imperfection. The Victorian world was not uniformly dirty, nor was it uniformly clean. It was uneven. A freshly washed face might sit above unwashed clothes. A spotless parlor might hide unsanitary living quarters behind it. Appearances mattered, sometimes more than actual conditions. This struggle with cleanliness shaped daily life in subtle ways. It influenced how people dressed, how they interacted, how they judged one another. It reminded them daily of their place in society and the limits imposed by class, gender, and circumstance. Cleanliness was an aspiration, not a guarantee. And in that gap between the two, Victorian life unfolded. Breakfast in the Victorian era was not designed to please. It existed to prepare the body for labor, not to provide enjoyment or relaxation. For most people, especially the working class, the first meal of the day was simple, repetitive, and shaped entirely by necessity. Comfort foods were a luxury. Calories mattered more than flavor. Food availability depended heavily on income, location, and season. Fresh ingredients were not guaranteed. Refrigeration did not exist, and preservation methods were limited. What you ate in the morning was often determined by what had survived the night without spoiling. Bread, if kept dry, was reliable. Everything else was uncertain. Bread formed the backbone of the Victorian breakfast. It was cheap, filling, and easy to store. In poorer households, it was often stale. Fresh bread was a sign of stability. Stale bread was softened with tea, milk, or water, or toasted over a fire if fuel allowed. Texture mattered less than volume. The goal was to quiet hunger, not satisfy taste. Tea played a central role, especially in Britain. It was warm, mildly stimulating, and socially accepted across classes. For many workers, tea replaced water entirely in the morning. Urban water supplies were often contaminated, and boiling water for tea made it safer to drink. Even weak tea provided comfort and routine in an otherwise demanding day. Milk, when available, was inconsistent. It spoiled quickly and was often diluted or contaminated before reaching consumers. Many families avoided it unless they trusted the source. Butter and cheese appeared on the table when budgets allowed, but they were not daily staples for the poor. These items were valued, measured carefully, and used sparingly. Protein was limited. Meat was expensive and usually reserved for the evening meal, when the family could eat together. Breakfast meat existed primarily in middle and upper-class households. Bacon, eggs, and sausages were symbols of comfort and stability, not common experience. For most people, these foods were occasional, not expected. Porridge was common in colder regions and among laborers. It was cheap, filling, and could be cooked in large quantities. Made from oats or other grains, it provided long-lasting energy. Flavoring was minimal. Salt was common. Sugar, if used at all, was rare and expensive. Porridge was endured, not celebrated. Children ate what adults ate. There was no concept of child-specific meals. Hunger did not excuse pickiness. Food refusal was seen as wasteful and disrespectful. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing or perched on stools, especially in crowded homes. Breakfast did not pause the household's momentum. It fit into it. Time was limited. Mornings were already crowded with tasks, and eating was only one of many responsibilities. Meals were short and efficient. Talking was minimal. Silence was common, not out of tension, but out of focus. Everyone was preparing mentally and physically for the day ahead. For working men, breakfast had to last. Once they left the house, there were no guarantees of additional food until evening. A weak breakfast meant fatigue, mistakes, or injury. This made quantity important, even when quality was lacking. People learned to eat more than they enjoyed, simply to endure the hours ahead. Women often ate last. In many households, mothers ensured everyone else was fed before serving themselves. This was not always a conscious sacrifice, but it was a common pattern. Food shortages were absorbed quietly, without comment. Hunger became part of daily life, managed rather than resolved. Middle-class breakfasts looked different but followed the same logic. They were more varied, more structured, and more formal, but still purposeful. Bread, eggs, preserves, and sometimes fish appeared on the table. Even here, the meal prepared the body for productivity and respectability, not leisure. Upper-class breakfasts, served later in the morning, were the exception. These meals included multiple courses and social interaction. However, they represented a small fraction of the population and should not be mistaken for the norm. For most Victorians, breakfast was not an event. It was a task. Food safety was a constant concern. Adulteration was widespread. Bread was sometimes mixed with fillers. Tea leaves were reused or substituted. Butter was extended with cheaper fats. Consumers rarely knew exactly what they were eating. Trust was fragile, and suspicion was common. Despite this, routine created a sense of stability. Eating the same food each morning provided predictability in an unpredictable world. The body adapted. Taste expectations adjusted. What modern standards might consider bland or insufficient became normal through repetition. Breakfast also reinforced social boundaries. The ability to eat well in the morning signaled security. A sparse table signaled vulnerability. These differences were visible, discussed, and quietly judged. Food revealed class without words. There was little room for indulgence. Sweet foods were rare. Sugar was expensive and associated with treats or special occasions. Jam, when present, was thinly spread. The idea of breakfast as a pleasurable start to the day did not align with the realities of Victorian life. Yet breakfast mattered deeply. It set the tone for endurance. It marked the transition from private rest to public effort. No matter how modest, the morning meal anchored the body before it was sent into factories, streets, fields, or homes filled with labor. Victorian breakfasts were shaped by limitation, not choice. They reflected a world where food was fuel, time was scarce, and comfort was secondary. Hunger was not an emergency. It was a condition to be managed. This was how the day truly began, not with satisfaction, but with preparation. Work in the Victorian era did not ease into the day. It claimed the morning immediately and without negotiation. Once breakfast ended, the rhythm of life shifted decisively toward labor. Whether inside a factory, on a farm, in a shop, or within the home itself, work was not a separate part of life, it was the structure that held everything else in place. For many, the workday began before sunrise. Factory whistles were among the most powerful timekeepers of the age. Their sound cut through streets and neighborhoods, signaling not just the start of labor, but the loss of personal time. When the whistle blew, hesitation was costly. Being late could mean docked pay, punishment, or dismissal. In a world with little job security, punctuality was survival. Factories demanded long hours. 12-hour shifts were common, and during peak production periods, they could stretch even longer. There were few breaks, and the pace was relentless. Machines did not slow for fatigue, illness, or age. Workers learned quickly that keeping up was not optional. Falling behind meant standing out, and standing out rarely ended well. Children worked alongside adults. Child labor was not hidden or unusual. It was expected. Children as young as 5 or 6 performed tasks suited to their size: cleaning machinery, carrying materials, running messages. Their workdays were nearly as long as those of adults, and the physical toll was significant. Education, when it existed at all, fit awkwardly around labor, not the other way around. In rural areas, the structure was different but no less demanding. Agricultural work followed the seasons rather than the clock, but mornings still began early. Animals needed care before anything else. Fields waited for no one. Weather dictated urgency. A missed morning could mean lost crops, wasted effort, or hunger months later. The land set the schedule, and people obeyed. Domestic service employed a massive portion of the population, particularly women. For servants, work began before the household stirred and ended long after it slept. Their labor was invisible by design. A well-run home appeared effortless precisely because servants absorbed the effort quietly. Their mornings were filled with cleaning, fire lighting, water carrying, and preparation, all completed before anyone noticed. Even those who worked from home were never truly off duty. Small shop owners lived above or behind their businesses. Craftspeople worked where they slept. Housewives managed households that functioned like small economies. Cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and budgeting were constant responsibilities, not tasks with clear beginnings or ends. Time off was rare. The concept of a weekend was not yet standardized. Sunday offered limited rest, but even then, expectations remained. Church attendance, family obligations, and preparation for the coming week filled the hours. Leisure, when it existed, was brief and carefully rationed. Idleness was viewed with suspicion across all classes. Work shaped identity. People were known by what they did, not how they felt. Occupation defined status, routine, and prospects. To be without work was not simply inconvenient, it was dangerous. Unemployment meant instability, hunger, and social judgment. There was little safety net and even less sympathy. The physical environment of work was harsh. Factories were loud, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Coal dust, cotton fibers, and chemical fumes filled the air. Injuries were common, and protection was minimal. Machinery was powerful and unforgiving. A moment of distraction could result in permanent damage. For women, work carried additional constraints. Many jobs were poorly paid and offered no protection. Domestic workers lived under constant supervision. Factory workers faced long hours followed by unpaid labor at home. Marriage did not necessarily reduce workloads. It often increased them. Women worked continuously, even when their labor went unrecognized or uncompensated. Work dictated daily movement. Entire neighborhoods emptied at the same time each morning, streets filling with workers heading toward mills, docks, and workshops. The city itself seemed to inhale and exhale with labor cycles. Morning meant movement. Evening meant return, exhaustion written plainly on faces and bodies. Mental fatigue accompanied physical strain. Repetitive tasks dulled the senses. Long hours left little room for reflection or creativity. Many workers learned to separate thought from action, performing duties mechanically to endure the monotony. This coping mechanism preserved energy but came at an emotional cost. Discipline was strict. Supervisors monitored behavior closely. Talking, resting, or slowing down could be punished. Control extended beyond productivity into conduct. Employers believed order created efficiency, and efficiency justified authority. Workers learned to regulate themselves, internalizing expectations even when no one was watching. Despite this, work was not universally resented. It provided structure and purpose in an uncertain world. For some, especially those who had known instability, regular employment offered a sense of belonging and predictability. Pride could be found in endurance, skill, or reliability. Work was hard, but it was also proof of worth. Pay was modest and often insufficient. Wages were calculated to meet survival needs, not comfort. Any disruption, illness, injury, bad weather could push a family into crisis. Savings were rare. Debt was common. Each morning's work carried the weight of immediate necessity. Children learned early that effort was expected, not rewarded. Praise was scarce. Survival was its own justification. This shaped attitudes toward authority, ambition, and resilience. The Victorian work ethic was not abstract. It was lived daily, reinforced by consequence. Work also reinforced class divisions. The type of labor you performed determined where you lived, how you dressed, and how others treated you. Physical labor marked the body visibly. Clean hands and softer routines signaled privilege. These differences were immediately apparent and rarely questioned. The morning marked the transition into this reality. Once work began, personal needs were postponed. Hunger, discomfort, and fatigue were managed internally. Complaints slowed production and attracted attention. Endurance became a social skill, practiced and perfected over time. Work dominated thought because it dominated survival. It dictated when you woke, where you went, how long you stayed, and how you returned. Everything else, meals, relationships, rest, was arranged around it. The Victorian day was built on labor, and morning was its foundation. From the moment the day began, work asserted its claim, shaping not just hours but identities, expectations, and the limits of daily life. This was not simply employment. It was existence organized around effort. In the Victorian era, time was experienced more than it was measured. While clocks existed, they were not the constant companions there today. For most people, the passage of time was understood through habit, sound, and repetition rather than minutes and seconds. Life moved according to shared rhythms, not personal schedules. Accurate timekeeping was a privilege. Large public clocks on churches, factories, and civic buildings served as communal references. Pocket watches were expensive and often unreliable. Many households owned no clock at all. Instead, people judged time by the position of the sun, the length of shadows, or the sequence of daily tasks they knew by heart. Morning was when work began. Midday was when hunger returned. Evening was when light faded. These were not vague impressions but practical markers that guided behavior. Precision was less important than consistency. As long as everyone followed the same rhythm, the system worked. Factory whistles were among the most influential time signals of the age. They announced the start and end of shifts, breaks, and transitions. Entire communities synchronized their days around these sounds. The whistle replaced the clock for many workers, dictating movement and obedience with a single note. Church bells played a similar role, especially in smaller towns and rural areas. They marked hours, called people to worship, and signaled important events. Bells were audible across wide areas, cutting through daily noise and reminding people where they were in the day's progression. Routine created reliability. Tasks were performed in the same order each day, reducing the need to track time consciously. You did not ask what hour it was. You knew what came next. This minimized uncertainty in a world already filled with risk. Meals followed work, not the clock. Lunch happened when there was a pause in labor. Dinner happened when people returned home and light allowed for eating. Seasonal changes altered schedules naturally. Winter days were shorter, and so were productive hours. Summer stretched the day, expanding both work and exhaustion. Transportation operated on flexible time. Trains initially ran on local time, which varied from town to town. This caused confusion and delay, especially as rail networks expanded. The need to coordinate schedules eventually led to standardized time, but for much of the Victorian period, local rhythms still dominated daily life. Waiting was normal. Appointments were approximate. Delays were expected. A person arriving early or late by a few minutes did not cause alarm. Patience was a learned skill, reinforced by necessity. Time was not something to be optimized. It was something to be endured. This flexibility did not mean inefficiency. Within familiar routines, people moved quickly and decisively. Tasks were completed with practiced efficiency. There was little second-guessing. Repetition created competence, and competence saved time without measuring it. Children absorbed this understanding early. They learned days by activities, not by hours. School began after certain chores. Play happened when work allowed it. Bedtime arrived when light disappeared or fatigue demanded rest. The clock did not define childhood. Routine did. For women managing households, time was fluid but relentless. Domestic labor had no clear start or finish. Tasks overlapped. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, and planning blended together. The day was divided not by hours but by needs as they arose. Precision became more important toward the end of the Victorian era, as industrialization intensified. Employers demanded punctuality. Railways required coordination. Offices began to value timetables. Even so, this shift was uneven and gradual. Many people lived between two systems, one governed by routine, the other by the clock. This transition created tension. Being late by a few minutes suddenly carried consequences. Time became something that could be lost, wasted, or stolen. Workers felt pressure not just to work hard, but to work on time. The clock began to carry authority. Despite this, routine remained central. Even when clocks were present, people still relied on habit. The clock confirmed what they already knew rather than telling them something new. Life remained structured around what needed to be done, not when it needed to be done down to the minute. Nightfall remained the most reliable signal. Artificial lighting was limited and expensive. When daylight ended, productivity slowed. Evening routines took over. Time naturally compressed, guiding people toward rest without instruction. This relationship with time shaped mindset. There was less urgency to fill every moment, but also less freedom to choose how moments were spent. Time belonged to work, to weather, to daylight, and to shared expectation. The Victorian experience of time was communal. Everyone moved together, adjusted together, and waited together. Individual schedules mattered less than collective rhythm. Being out of sync was noticeable and uncomfortable. Time was not a personal resource to manage. It was an environment to move through. And mourning was simply the first step into that environment. Privacy, as a daily expectation, barely existed in the Victorian world. The idea of having uninterrupted personal space, private thoughts, or time alone was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For most people, life unfolded in shared rooms, shared beds, and shared routines, leaving little room for solitude. Homes were crowded. Working-class families often lived in one or two rooms, regardless of how many people occupied them. Sleeping, eating, working, and socializing happened in the same space. Walls were thin and sound traveled easily. Conversations, arguments, illness, and exhaustion were all public knowledge within the household. Beds were shared out of necessity. Parents slept alongside children. Siblings shared mattresses. Lodgers sometimes occupied the same room as families. Physical closeness was constant and unavoidable. Privacy of the body was minimal, and modesty adapted accordingly. People learned not to react to what they could not change. Morning routines unfolded in full view. Washing, dressing, and preparing for the day happened with others present. Screens or curtains provided limited separation, but they did not block sound or movement. Embarrassment was common but tolerated. Over time, it became background noise to survival. Personal belongings were few and rarely secure. Storage space was limited. Clothing, tools, and letters were accessible to others by default. The concept of something being yours alone was fragile. Borrowing without asking was common within families. Boundaries were practical rather than emotional. Even thoughts were not entirely private. Expectations, duties, and social roles were reinforced constantly through observation and comment. Children grew up watched, corrected, and instructed at all times. There was little opportunity to develop a sense of self separate from family or work. In wealthier homes, privacy existed but was still structured. Separate bedrooms, studies, and parlors created physical boundaries. However, servants moved silently through these spaces, always present but expected to be invisible. True isolation remained rare, even among the upper classes. Servants themselves had almost no privacy. They slept in shared quarters or small attic rooms. Their time was monitored. Their movements were noticed. Even rest was conditional, dependent on the needs of the household. Personal space was sacrificed entirely to employment. Outside the home, privacy did not improve. Streets were busy, noisy, and communal. Daily life was visible. Neighbors knew one another's habits, routines, and struggles. Reputation mattered because it was constantly on display. Behavior was shaped by the knowledge of being seen. Letters were a partial exception. Writing offered a controlled space for expression, but even letters were not fully private. Paper was expensive, literacy was uneven, and correspondence was often read aloud or shared. Secrets traveled slowly and rarely stayed contained. Illness removed any remaining privacy. Sickness was managed at home, in shared spaces. Pain, weakness, and recovery were witnessed by family members. There was little separation between personal suffering and domestic life. Endurance was visible and expected. This lack of privacy shaped emotional expression. People learned to regulate themselves internally. Strong emotions were managed quietly. Vulnerability was risky when there was no space to retreat. Self-control became a social necessity rather than a moral ideal. Children adapted early. They grew up without private rooms or private time. Independence developed through responsibility rather than isolation. Identity was shaped through role and contribution, not introspection. The absence of privacy also created resilience. Constant exposure to others required negotiation, patience, and tolerance. Conflicts were resolved quickly or endured. Avoidance was difficult. People learned to coexist, even under strain. Modern ideas of alone time or personal boundaries would have seemed impractical or indulgent. In the Victorian context, survival depended on cooperation. Individual comfort was secondary to collective function. Privacy, when it appeared, was temporary and situational. A walk alone. A moment awake before others stirred. A quiet task completed early. These brief intervals were valued but not expected. They were accidents, not rights. This environment shaped how people thought about themselves. The self was embedded in family, labor, and community. Personal desires were filtered through obligation. Silence was often the only private space available. The Victorian morning reflected this reality clearly. Waking up meant re-entering shared space immediately. There was no gradual transition from solitude to society. One opened their eyes and was already among others. Privacy was not something to lose. It was something most people never had. In the Victorian era, clothing served a purpose far beyond decoration or personal expression. It was a form of protection against the weather, against dirt, against social judgment, and against the visible signs of poverty. What you wore shaped how the world treated you, and once you stepped outside, your clothing spoke before you did. Dressing took time and effort. Garments were layered, structured, and often restrictive. Undergarments created shape and absorbed sweat. Outer layers provided warmth and durability. Each piece had a function, and together they formed a barrier between the body and a harsh environment. For working-class people, clothing was primarily practical. Fabrics were thick and rough, chosen for endurance rather than comfort. Wool and heavy cotton dominated. Clothes were worn daily, exposed to soot, dust, grease, and weather. They had to survive repeated use, not look new. Most people owned very few outfits. A typical worker might have one set of clothes for labor and one slightly better set for Sundays or special occasions. Repairs were constant. Buttons were replaced, hems were mended, patches were added wherever fabric thinned. Clothing told a history of work through visible wear. Cleanliness, as much as it existed, was communicated through clothing. A clean collar, cuffs, or apron suggested order and respectability. Even when full garments could not be washed often, these smaller pieces were changed or cleaned to maintain appearances. The illusion of cleanliness mattered deeply. For women, clothing carried additional weight. Dresses were long, layered, and heavy. Corsets shaped the body according to social ideals, restricting movement and breathing. Despite discomfort, these garments signaled propriety and discipline. To dress improperly was to invite judgment, regardless of circumstance. Men's clothing emphasized durability and uniformity. Trousers, shirts, waistcoats, and jackets followed predictable patterns. Variation existed in quality rather than design. A well-fitted coat or polished shoes suggested stability. Worn or ill-fitting clothes marked economic vulnerability. Children's clothing mirrored adult styles, scaled down. There was little accommodation for play or comfort. Clothes restricted movement, yet children were expected to work, run errands, and assist with labor. Growth meant constant adjustment, often handled through let-out seams and reused garments. Weather made clothing essential. Homes were cold. Streets were wet and dirty. Without proper layers, exposure led quickly to illness. Coats, shawls, and hats were not optional. Even indoors, clothing stayed on. Removing layers signaled rest or intimacy, not daily life. Morning dressing was a shared activity. In crowded homes, people dressed in sequence, negotiating space and time. Clothing was passed hand to hand. Mistakes misplaced items. Missing buttons caused frustration. Each garment mattered because replacements were not guaranteed. Shoes were particularly important. Streets were uneven and often filthy. Footwear protected against injury and contamination. Good shoes were expensive and treasured. Soles were repaired repeatedly. Walking barefoot outdoors marked extreme poverty and drew immediate attention. Clothing also enforced social order. Class distinctions were visible at a glance. Fabric quality, fit, and cleanliness communicated status. While it was possible to imitate higher-class styles, subtle details wear patterns. Materials, tailoring revealed the truth. Appearance was closely monitored. This scrutiny created pressure. People worked hard to maintain a respectable look, even when resources were limited. Clothing was adjusted, brushed, and cared for daily. A tidy appearance could protect against suspicion, dismissal, or mistreatment. Uniforms reinforced authority. Factory workers, servants, and officials wore specific garments that signaled role and obedience. These clothes removed individuality and emphasized function. Wearing the uniform meant accepting the expectations that came with it. Despite restrictions, clothing also offered small comforts. Familiar garments carried warmth and memory. A well-worn coat or shawl provided reassurance as well as protection. These items became personal in a world where few things truly were. Fashion existed, but it moved slowly for most people. Trends filtered down gradually, often years after appearing in elite circles. Practicality moderated style. What mattered was whether clothing lasted, not whether it impressed. The act of dressing prepared the body for exposure. Once clothed, a person was ready to face the street, the workplace, and the scrutiny of others. Clothing completed the transition from private space, however limited, to public life. In this way, clothing functioned as armor. It did not make life easier, but it made it survivable. It absorbed dirt, hid weariness, and signaled belonging. Without it, the Victorian world would have been even harsher. Every morning, people wrapped themselves in layers not just of fabric but of expectation. Health in the Victorian era was something people reacted to, not something they actively safeguarded. Illness was expected. Discomfort was normal. Prevention as we understand it today barely existed. The body was pushed until it failed, and when it did, people adjusted rather than stopped. Medical knowledge was limited and unevenly applied. Germ theory was still emerging, and for much of the period, disease was blamed on bad air, foul smells, or moral weakness. Clean environments were valued more for how they looked and smelled than for their actual impact on health. Invisible threats were poorly understood and rarely addressed. Minor illness was ignored. Headaches, persistent coughs, joint pain, and exhaustion were part of daily life. Complaining about them served little purpose. Missing work because of sickness often meant losing wages or employment altogether. As a result, people learned to work through pain unless they were physically unable to stand. Home remedies were the first line of defense. Families relied on inherited knowledge: herbal teas, poultices, compresses, and rest when possible. These treatments offered comfort but rarely cure. Effectiveness mattered less than availability. When professional help was expensive or distant, familiarity became authority. Doctors existed, but access was limited. For the working class, medical care was a last resort. Fees were high and outcomes were uncertain. Many physicians still used treatments like bloodletting, purging, or strong tonics that weakened patients further. Seeing a doctor was not automatically reassuring. Hospitals carried fear rather than comfort. They were places for the desperate, the injured, or those without family support. Conditions were often crowded and unsanitary. Survival was uncertain. Many people preferred to recover or die at home rather than enter an institution. Work environments actively damaged health. Factories exposed workers to dust, chemicals, heat, and constant noise. Ventilation was poor. Injuries were frequent. Protective equipment was rare or non-existent. Long-term damage to lungs, hearing, and joints was common and largely accepted. Child health was especially fragile. Infant mortality rates were high. Childhood illnesses spread quickly in crowded homes and schools. Many children did not survive into adulthood, and this reality shaped emotional expectations. Attachment existed, but it was tempered by experience and caution. Nutrition affected health silently. Diets lacked variety and essential nutrients. Hunger and deficiency weakened bodies over time, making people more susceptible to illness. The connection between food quality and long-term health was poorly understood, even when patterns were observed. Mental health was rarely acknowledged. Stress, anxiety, and despair were framed as personal weakness or moral failure. Emotional suffering was expected to be endured quietly. Support systems were informal and inconsistent. There was little language to describe psychological strain beyond vague terms like nerves or melancholy. Women faced additional health risks. Repeated pregnancies, limited medical care, and physically demanding labor took a heavy toll. Pain related to childbirth or long-term exhaustion was normalized. Women were expected to continue managing households even when unwell. Rest was not prescribed, it was negotiated. Only severe illness justified stopping work, and even then, recovery time was brief. Convalescence was a privilege associated with wealth. For most people, healing had to fit around responsibility. Public health measures emerged slowly. Sanitation reforms, clean water systems, and housing improvements developed unevenly across cities. Where they existed, they dramatically improved survival. Where they did not, illness remained a constant presence. Fear of disease shaped behavior subtly. People avoided certain neighborhoods, smells, or individuals perceived as unclean. Illness carried stigma. Being sick risked social as well as physical consequences. Despite all this, people adapted. They learned to recognize limits, pace themselves when possible, and accept decline as part of aging. Health was not about optimization or longevity. It was about maintaining enough strength to meet daily demands. Survival itself became a measure of wellness. If you could rise, dress, eat, and work, you were considered healthy enough. Anything beyond that was excess. The Victorian body was not protected. It was used. And each morning began with the quiet assessment of whether it could endure another day. Victorian life unfolded under continuous social observation. Expectations governed behavior at every level, shaping how people spoke, moved, worked, dressed, and interacted. These expectations were not written down in one place, but everyone knew them. Following them meant safety and acceptance. Violating them invited judgment, exclusion, or punishment. Respectability was the central ideal. It was less about wealth and more about behavior. A person could be poor and still be considered respectable if they appeared disciplined, hardworking, and orderly. Conversely, wealth did not excuse visible disorder. Respectability acted as a social shield, protecting individuals from suspicion and interference. Morning behavior mattered. Rising early, appearing clean, dressing properly, and moving with purpose signaled moral character. Laziness was not just a personal flaw. It was a social offense. Being seen idle during working hours attracted attention and criticism, especially among the working class. Reputation spread quickly. Neighborhoods were tightly knit, and daily routines were predictable. People noticed absences, changes, and inconsistencies. A missed workday, a neglected child, or an untidy appearance could spark gossip. Stories traveled faster than facts, and once formed, impressions were difficult to undo. Gender roles were rigidly enforced. Men were expected to be providers, disciplined and emotionally restrained. Women were expected to manage households, raise children, and embody moral stability. Deviating from these roles invited scrutiny. Social approval depended on visible conformity. Children were not exempt. They were judged as reflections of their parents. Well-behaved children suggested a competent household. Misbehavior implied moral failure at home. Discipline was public and often harsh, reinforcing expectations early and repeatedly. Class boundaries shaped every interaction. Speech patterns, posture, and manners signaled social position. Knowing your place was essential. Overstepping these boundaries, speaking too boldly, dressing too finely, or behaving too casually was seen as inappropriate and suspicious. Workplaces reinforced social norms aggressively. Obedience, punctuality, and endurance were moral virtues. Questioning authority or expressing dissatisfaction marked a person as troublesome. Employers expected gratitude for employment, regardless of conditions. Religion strengthened these expectations. Church attendance signaled respectability and moral alignment. Absence was noticed. Sermons reinforced values of discipline, patience, and submission. Faith provided meaning, but it also reinforced social order. Failure was personalized. Poverty, illness, or unemployment were often interpreted as moral shortcomings rather than structural problems. Sympathy existed, but it was conditional. Those who appeared to accept their position quietly were helped more readily than those who protested. This constant pressure shaped behavior deeply. People learned to regulate themselves even when no one was watching. Shame became an internal mechanism of control. Public punishment was less necessary when individuals corrected themselves preemptively. Moments of deviation were risky. Public emotion, unconventional choices, or visible despair disrupted social expectations. While these moments happened, they were quickly corrected or contained. Stability was valued over honesty. Yet these expectations also created predictability. Knowing the rules provided a framework for survival. People understood what was required to avoid attention. Conformity offered protection in an uncertain world. Social life was therefore cautious. Friendships formed within class boundaries. Conversations avoided sensitive topics. Behavior aimed to be unremarkable rather than expressive. Blending in was safer than standing out. Morning routines reflected this pressure. From the moment the day began, people prepared not just for work, but for judgment. Appearance, posture, and behavior were adjusted before stepping outside. Victorian society did not offer privacy from expectation. Every action was performed under an imagined audience. Living meant performing stability, day after day. This was not merely tradition. It was a survival strategy shaped by consequence. As daylight faded, the Victorian day did not gently slow, it narrowed. Energy was depleted, bodies were worn, and attention turned toward recovery rather than enjoyment. Evening existed to restore just enough strength to repeat the cycle again the next morning. Rest, in the modern sense, was rare. Artificial light was limited and expensive. Candles and oil lamps provided weak illumination and required constant maintenance. Fuel had to be purchased, stored, and rationed. As a result, evenings were dim and functional. Activities were chosen carefully to conserve both light and energy. Homes cooled quickly after sunset. Fires were allowed to die down unless warmth was essential. Families gathered close together for heat. Movement slowed not by choice, but by environment. Darkness and cold naturally reduced activity. Evening meals were the main meal of the day. For working families, this was often the first time everyone was together. Food was simple but slightly more substantial than breakfast. Stews, bread, and whatever meat could be afforded filled the table. Eating restored strength but rarely produced comfort. Conversation, when it happened, was practical. The day was reviewed, plans were made, and necessities were discussed. Silence was common, born of fatigue rather than tension. People saved their energy for what mattered. Entertainment was modest. Reading, if possible, required light and literacy. Stories were told orally. Children played quietly. Music, when present, was informal and brief. Leisure was shaped by what the body could still manage, not by desire. Women's work continued into the evening. Cleaning, mending, preparing for the next day, and caring for children filled the hours. Their labor did not end with nightfall. The idea of being off duty did not apply. For servants, evening meant heightened responsibility. Dinners had to be served, fires managed, and households prepared for rest. Their day ended last. Fatigue was constant, but visibility demanded composure. Personal care was minimal. Washing again was rare. Clothes were loosened but not fully removed until sleep. Shoes were set aside carefully. Tomorrow's needs were considered before tonight's comfort. Illness or exhaustion did not pause evening routines. The household still required maintenance. Only severe conditions altered expectations. Endurance extended into the night. Bedtime followed darkness more than preference. Staying awake cost resources. People slept when the environment made wakefulness inefficient. Night was not reclaimed for personal time. It was surrendered to necessity. Sleep itself was fragmented. Shared rooms, noise, and discomfort disrupted rest. Waking during the night was common. Still, sleep was valued as the body's only repair mechanism. Evenings were not lonely, but they were not leisurely. Togetherness was functional. Families shared space because it was efficient, not because it was restful. The Victorian evening closed the day without ceremony. There was no deliberate winding down, no structured relaxation. The goal was simple: recover enough to begin again. In this way, the day folded back into itself, ending where it began, at the edge of fatigue. Victorian daily life was not designed to achieve balance, fulfillment, or personal growth. It was structured around endurance. Each day was a repetition, and survival depended on the ability to move through that repetition without breaking. Stability mattered more than happiness, and continuity mattered more than comfort. The day did not exist as a standalone experience. It was part of an ongoing cycle that rarely paused long enough to reflect upon itself. Morning prepared the body. Work consumed it. Evening repaired it just enough to repeat the process. There was little sense of a week or a phase of life. Time blurred into routine. Hope was practical rather than aspirational. People hoped for steady work, manageable health, and enough food. Long-term dreams were shaped by realism. Ambition existed, but it was cautious. Risk threatened survival, and survival took priority over possibility. Change happened slowly. Improvements in living conditions, health, and labor rights unfolded over generations, not lifetimes. Many people lived and died within the same patterns they inherited. Progress was something observed in others, not experienced personally. This endurance shaped values. Patience, restraint, and reliability were prized. Emotional expression was limited because emotion consumed energy. Resilience was not celebrated. It was assumed. The ability to continue was its own achievement. Family structures reflected this reality. Relationships were practical partnerships. Affection existed, but it was secondary to function. Everyone had a role, and fulfilling it ensured collective survival. Individual needs were often deferred indefinitely. Loss was familiar. Death, illness, and hardship were constant companions. People learned to absorb grief quickly because daily demands did not stop. Mourning occurred alongside work, not instead of it. Moments of joy existed, but they were brief and often unplanned. Laughter during shared meals, warmth from a fire, a successful day's work. These moments mattered precisely because they were rare. They did not define life. They punctuated it. Modern concepts of self-care or work-life balance would have felt abstract. The Victorian world did not offer space for such ideas. Life was not something to optimize. It was something to endure. And yet, endurance created continuity. Communities functioned. Families persisted. Skills were passed down. Culture survived because people kept going, day after day, without expecting ease. This does not mean Victorian life was joyless. It means joy was not the goal. Stability was. Predictability was. Survival was. Every morning, people woke not to pursue fulfillment, but to maintain momentum. And in doing so, they built a world that moved forward not through comfort, but through persistence. This was the quiet strength of Victorian daily life, a strength born not from choice, but from necessity. And it ended each day exactly where it began, with the preparation to endure once more. As we reach the end of this journey, one thing becomes clear: Victorian daily life was not built around comfort, balance, or personal freedom. It was built around persistence. From the moment the day began to the moment it faded into darkness, life demanded effort, restraint, and adaptation. People woke when nature and routine commanded them to wake. They worked long hours under constant observation. They managed hunger, illness, and exhaustion as ordinary conditions rather than emergencies. Privacy was rare, rest was limited, and expectations were unforgiving. Yet within this harsh structure, life continued quietly, steadily, and relentlessly. Communities held together not because life was easy, but because cooperation was unavoidable. Families functioned as systems of shared labor and shared sacrifice. Identity was shaped less by personal desire and more by responsibility. Each day resembled the last, not because imagination was lacking, but because stability was the only reliable defense against uncertainty. Understanding this world helps us see the past more clearly and the present more honestly. Many comforts we now consider basic were once unimaginable. Time, privacy, health, and choice were privileges unevenly distributed, not assumptions. Victorian endurance did not come from optimism, but from necessity, and that endurance quietly carried society forward. Thank you for spending this time exploring history beyond dates and events, history as it was lived, felt, and endured. If you enjoyed this deep dive into everyday life of the past, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden layers of history. Until next time, take care and thank you for watching.